What if everything we've been told about human history is wrong? Across forgotten maps and buried beneath our cities lies a chilling possibility. The Tartarian Empire, an ancient civilization more advanced than anything we can imagine.
I think it was a civilization that emerged from shamanism, but did not stay at the hunter-gatherer stage.
Strange architecture, mysterious world fairs, and entire stories erased from history point to something we were never meant to know. Even Graham Hancock, who has long argued that vital chapters of our past are missing.
We are dealing with the fingerprints of a lost civilization that mapped the world and that left evidence of that mapping.
Warns that history is not as simple as we're taught. Could this be the greatest cover-up of all time? The truth may shock you, and it changes everything. Forgotten maps and vanished names. For centuries, the word Tartary appeared across European maps like an enigma sprawled over half the world. It stretched from the edges of Eastern Europe, through the endless Siberian plains, and down into parts of Central Asia. To those who lived at the time, Tartary was not a small, obscure place, but an immense landmass whose borders blurred with mystery. Travelers returning from the east spoke of nomadic peoples, endless forests, cities of stone, and cultures unlike anything in Europe. Yet, despite its prominence on maps and in records, the word faded almost overnight. By the 19th century, Tartary had all but disappeared from schoolbooks, replaced with the neat divisions of Russia, Mongolia, China, and Central Asia. What was once a vast unified space in the European imagination had been quietly redefined, fragmented, and forgotten. When historians are asked why Tartary vanished from maps, the explanation sounds simple. It was never an empire, they say, only a vague geographic label for lands Europeans didn't yet understand. But this explanation leaves behind a trail of unease. Why would an entire term, so widely used for centuries, collapse into nothing? Why would maps once proudly showing Great Tartary or Independent Tartary later be reissued with those names scrubbed away? It is as though the cartographers of the past had sketched a reality we are no longer meant to see. Some argue it was nothing more than a linguistic update, a byproduct of better exploration and clearer national borders. Others, however, whisper about erasure, deliberate acts of rewriting that conceal a deeper story. Consider the context. Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries was obsessed with cataloging the world. Explorers returned with maps, manuscripts, and artifacts, and libraries filled with information. The lands labeled Tartary were described with awe, even fear. Stories told of sprawling fortified cities, rulers of immense wealth, and cultures with their own advanced sciences. This was no blank space. Yet, by the Enlightenment, descriptions of Tartary had grown sparse, treated as if the entire region had little worth beyond its geography. What happened to those earlier accounts? Why are so many of them hard to find today? Adding to the mystery are maps that depict features contradicting the accepted historical timeline. Some show architectural icons placed deep in Siberia. Others mark vast networks of rivers and canals that have since vanished or been dismissed as errors. Were early cartographers mistaken? Or were they capturing pieces of a civilization whose traces were later buried? To dismiss it all as bad geography seems almost too easy, especially when we consider how quickly the narrative changed once new powers dominated the region and history books began to align with their political interests. The disappearance of Tartary from records also echoes something we see again and again in history. Names erased, cultures absorbed, and legacies rewritten. Empires fall, and victors reshape the past to suit their own stories. Yet, Tartary's case feels different. It was not an isolated kingdom or tribe. It was, at least on the maps, a massive entity, as large and imposing as Russia or China. And still, it slipped away without the kind of closure we find in the fall of Rome or the collapse of the Aztec Empire. No dramatic war, no clear conquest, just silence. That silence has fueled modern theories suggesting Tartary was more than a forgotten word. Could it have been the shadow of a civilization far more advanced than we realize? Could maps and old accounts have been intentionally altered? The memory of an empire systematically removed? These are unsettling questions, but they emerge naturally when we trace how a vast and prominent name in our collective geography was allowed to vanish so completely. If Tartary was nothing at all, why does its erasure feel so deliberate? This is where the story of the so-called Tartarian Empire begins, not with definitive proof of its existence, but with the mystery of its absence. A vast region once charted on every major map now reduced to a historical footnote, a forgotten name, a ghostly echo of something larger. Whether it was a phantom born of cartographers' ignorance or the first clue to a suppressed history, Tartary continues to haunt those who dig into the cracks of the past, demanding we ask the question no one in authority seems eager to answer. What exactly was erased from history? Architecture that shouldn't exist. Walk through almost any major city built during the 18th or 19th century, and you will notice something peculiar if you look closely enough. Towering domes, intricately carved facades, enormous archways, and entire blocks of stonework that seem to rival the great monuments of Rome or Greece appear in places you wouldn't expect. Chicago, San Francisco, Melbourne, Moscow, St. Petersburg, and even smaller towns boast structures so ornate and colossal that one can't help but ask how such wonders were constructed in the supposed age of horse-drawn carriages and hand tools. The official story attributes these marvels to architects of the industrial age, a period of rising wealth and rapid urban development. We are told they were the product of hard work, imported materials, and emerging technologies like cast iron and steel. But critics of this narrative point to the sheer scale and uniformity of the style across continents as reason for suspicion. How could nations thousands of miles apart, with different cultures and resources, all produce architecture of such similar grandeur in such a narrow window of time? Consider the domed state capitals of the United States, nearly identical in style to grand cathedrals in Eastern Europe, or the monumental courthouses and train stations scattered across the Midwest, echoing the scale of palaces in Paris and St. Petersburg. Why do these buildings, constructed in supposedly different contexts, appear as though they were cut from the same blueprint? Mainstream historians chalk this up to global architectural trends, the influence of neoclassicism, and the exchange of ideas through books and education. Yet for those who peer deeper, it raises the possibility that these are surviving fragments of a much older tradition, one that has been written out of history. Then there are the anomalies at ground level. Look at old photographs or examine the lower floors of some of these buildings, and you'll find half-buried windows, doors that open into sidewalks, and basements with ornate stonework, clearly never intended to remain hidden underground. Urban development, city planners say, is to blame. Streets are raised, landfills level uneven terrain, and over time ground levels naturally shift. But the pattern repeats too often, across too many cities, for skeptics to dismiss so easily. The mudflood theory, which we'll explore further, suggests these sunken levels might be scars of a catastrophe that literally buried parts of a forgotten civilization. World fairs provide another curious case. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, massive expos were built in record time, showcasing breathtaking domes, towers, and palaces. Official accounts insist these temporary white city structures were made of plaster and meant to be demolished. And yet, photographic evidence shows detailing and craftsmanship that rivals permanent stone architecture. How could temporary structures achieve such precision? Were they really temporary at all? Or were some of them older buildings repurposed, misattributed, and then conveniently destroyed to erase their true origins? Take the example of the St. Louis World's Fair of 1904 or the Chicago Columbian Exposition of 1893. These fairs were said to be built in less than 2 years, using primitive technology compared to modern standards, and dismantled soon after. But their scale was immense, rivaling the largest cities of the time. How do you construct entire cities of grandeur, only to erase them almost without a trace? For many, this feels less like temporary spectacle and more like a cover story. Perhaps these expos were staged to explain the sudden appearance of majestic architecture that already existed, too advanced to fit comfortably into the official narrative. The mainstream story remains unshaken. Talented architects, visionary planners, and industrial wealth explain it all. But questions linger. Why are so many of these buildings attributed to relatively unknown architects who seemingly appeared, created masterpieces, and vanished into obscurity? Why do some records of construction appear incomplete or contradictory? And why do cities continue to bury and demolish these structures rather than preserve them? These are not idle curiosities. They strike at the heart of how history is told, and what might have been hidden. The uniformity, the grandeur, the buried levels. Each detail builds toward a larger suspicion that we are not looking at the proud achievements of the industrial age, but the remnants of something much older, much more advanced, and much more deliberately erased. If Tartary was real, its fingerprints may not lie in old texts alone, but in the very streets and skylines we walk past every day. And once you start noticing, it becomes impossible not to ask. Were these cities truly built in a handful of years? Or were they inherited from a civilization erased from history? The mud flood mystery. If there is one element of the Tartarian narrative that stops people in their tracks, it is the so-called mud flood. At first glance, the idea sounds absurd, even impossible, that within the last few centuries, some kind of global or near-global event blanketed cities in layers of mud, burying entire lower floors of buildings and erasing traces of a forgotten civilization. And yet, once you begin looking at the evidence presented by believers, the anomalies pile up in ways that demand attention. Start with the simplest clue: half-buried windows. All across the world, from European capitals to small American towns, you can find buildings with ornate window frames peeking out at sidewalk level, sometimes several feet below the current street surface. Doors appear to open directly into walls of dirt. Basements are finished with the same fine stonework as the visible facades, as though they were never meant to be underground. The official explanation is straightforward. Cities grow, roads are raised, and time slowly changes the ground level. But when the same architectural oddity repeats across continents, skeptics wonder if something larger is being ignored. Photographs from the 19th century provide even more fuel for suspicion. Images of workers digging out city streets reveal buried arches, windows, and doorways that appear to belong to structures much older than the roads being constructed above them. These are often brushed off as ordinary urban excavation, the natural byproduct of rebuilding modern infrastructure atop old foundations. But those who argue for a mud flood point out that entire blocks seem to have been unearthed, as if they were once functioning ground floors suddenly suffocated under several feet of earth. The theory claims that a massive catastrophe, whether geological, environmental, or even engineered, covered much of the world in mud. Some imagine an enormous flood of liquefied soil unleashed by earthquakes or melting glaciers. Others suggest volcanic ash, atmospheric anomalies, or even weaponized energy. Whatever the cause, the result would have been catastrophic. Cities swallowed, populations scattered, and histories rewritten to hide what had been lost. The survivors, they argue, inherited buildings they could not explain, and rewrote the story of their origins to fit within a neat, controlled timeline. Of course, mainstream historians reject this idea outright. To them, buried levels are simply the result of centuries of rebuilding. Cities like Rome, Paris, or Istanbul have always been layered upon themselves, streets rising higher as debris and fill accumulate. But believers counter with examples from newer cities that supposedly should not have such dramatic layering. Why, they ask, do places less than 200 years old show the same sunken doors and windows as ancient capitals? Why do photographs reveal excavations not of a few scattered ruins, but of seemingly intact urban levels hidden below? The mud flood mystery grows more tangled when tied to sudden historical events. The Great Fire of Chicago in 1871, the San Francisco earthquake of 1906, and countless other disasters are sometimes reinterpreted as convenient cover stories. Were these truly accidents of nature and chance, or were they engineered opportunities to demolish and rebuild, erasing inconvenient evidence of a deeper past? The fact that many temporary World Fair structures, built with impossible grandeur, were swiftly destroyed after exhibitions only adds to the suspicion that we are being shown staged histories. Critics ask a fair question. If a mud flood really occurred, where is the geological evidence? Where are the massive layers of displaced sediment, the catastrophic records in soil cores and climate data? Thus far, no scientific consensus supports such a global event in recent centuries. But here lies the tension. Absence of accepted evidence, believers argue, does not equal absence of truth. If entire civilizations could be erased from maps, what is stopping geological anomalies from being ignored, mislabeled, or suppressed?
We are dealing with the fingerprints of a lost civilization that mapped the world and that left evidence of that mapping.
The mud flood theory may not offer clear answers, but it raises questions that gnaw at our sense of certainty. Why are so many buildings designed with ornate underground levels that serve no practical purpose today? Why does buried architecture often look too refined to be treated as mere basements? And why do official records so often gloss over or contradict what old photographs appear to show? If nothing else, the mud flood is a story of silence. Silence in textbooks, silence in museums, silence in the explanations handed down by authority. And in that silence, suspicion thrives. Whether it was a true global cataclysm or simply a misunderstood pattern of urban development, the mud flood theory forces us to ask whether parts of our history have been covered up, quite literally, beneath layers of earth. If Tartaria existed, the mud flood may have been its tomb, sealing away its greatest cities and leaving us only fragments to puzzle over centuries later. Erased technology and suppressed evidence. If the mystery of Tartaria ended with maps and buried architecture, it might be easy to dismiss. But the narrative grows darker when you start looking at what some call the deliberate destruction of evidence. Fires, wars, demolitions, and conveniently timed renovations have wiped out countless structures that could have served as proof of something greater. One begins to notice a pattern. When questions arise about buildings too advanced for their supposed era, those buildings often don't survive long enough to be studied. Skeptics call it coincidence. Others believe it is the mark of a systematic cover-up. Take the Great World Fairs once more. The Chicago Columbian Exposition of 1893 produced an entire city of breathtaking domes, vast plazas, and seemingly permanent monuments. Officially, most of it was constructed with plaster and wood, never intended to last. Within 2 years, fires swept through and destroyed almost all of it. Similar stories are told about fairs in St. Louis, Paris, and San Francisco. Each time, enormous structures, built with suspicious speed and precision, were demolished or lost to disasters almost immediately. Were these truly temporary facades, or were they the inherited remnants of a civilization we weren't supposed to recognize? Then there is the curious absence of construction records. For many iconic buildings attributed to the 18th and 19th centuries, archives contain little more than vague mentions of builders, incomplete blueprints, or after-the-fact documentation. It is as though the process of design and construction left almost no trace, despite being projects of massive scale and cost. Why do we lack detailed records for structures that should have been considered national treasures? Why do so many names of architects vanish into obscurity after a single grand work? It is these gaps that feed the suspicion that what we are told about their origins may not be the whole truth. Believers in the Tartarian theory argue that these buildings were not simply impressive feats of human labor, but relics of advanced technology that has since been erased. They point to features like massive domes crowned with strange metallic structures, spires bristling with antenna-like designs, and intricate detailing that seems engineered for more than beauty. According to the theory, these were not just decorations. They were components of an energy system, tapping into natural forces to produce free and limitless power. The idea may sound outrageous, but once raised, it is difficult to ignore the uncanny repetition of these features across continents. Mainstream historians explain these elements as stylistic flourishes, symbols of religious or civic pride, or simple expressions of neoclassical design. But critics counter that beauty alone cannot explain their apparent uniformity. Why would city halls in America, cathedrals in Europe, and palaces in Asia all share the same domes, spires, and layouts, built with eerie precision, often in a matter of years? If these were simply trends, why do they resemble a kind of technological blueprint repeated across the world? Fires play an especially suspicious role in this story. The 1871 Great Chicago Fire, the 1906 San Francisco earthquake and fire, the destruction of Moscow's architectural gems, and countless others seem to follow the same pattern. Ancient-looking structures obliterated in disasters that left conveniently little behind. Even when some buildings survived, they were often gutted, rebuilt, or renovated beyond recognition. The result is a world in which vast amounts of monumental architecture supposedly existed for only a brief moment, leaving us to wonder if they were erased intentionally. This is where the phrase "they lied to us" resonates most. If Tartaria did exist, if it left behind evidence of technologies far beyond what we are told was possible, then rewriting history would not just be about names on a map. It would be about stripping humanity of a legacy of knowledge. Energy systems, architectural methods, even ways of living in harmony with natural forces could have been lost in the process. What if we are not living at the height of civilization, but in the ruins of one far greater? It is a haunting thought, and one that grows stronger as you look at the ruins, the fires, the missing archives, and the suspicious uniformity. Whether you accept the theory or not, the fact remains that history is littered with gaps, sudden shifts, and unexplained destructions. Was it all chance, or was there a deliberate effort to erase what came before? If Tartaria's technology was real, then its absence today is not just a mystery. It is a silence that has been imposed on us, and that silence may be the clearest evidence of all. The civilization they don't want you to remember. At this point, the pieces of the puzzle form a disturbing picture. Maps that vanish from circulation, architecture that defies explanation, entire districts swallowed by mud, and technology hinted at in the very shapes of the buildings themselves. All of it suggests we may not be standing at the pinnacle of human achievement as we are told. Instead, we may be living among the faint ruins of something greater, something erased from history. This is where the theory of the Tartarian Empire makes its most staggering claim, that there once existed an advanced global civilization more sophisticated than anything we can imagine today. Supporters argue that this empire was not bound by the limits we assign to 18th or 19th century builders. It possessed technologies and methods that allowed for the effortless construction of colossal domes, intricate stonework, and vast networks of energy distribution. The ornate facades and strange metallic ornaments found on government buildings and cathedrals are reinterpreted as remnants of a lost science. If this civilization truly existed, then the narrative of human progress is built on a lie, and perhaps that is why, as some believe, they lied to us. The name Tartaria itself, once sprawled across maps, now lingers only as a ghost. To mainstream historians, it was never more than a vague label for unknown lands. But the sheer scale of its presence on cartography, combined with the architectural anomalies that stretch from Moscow to San Francisco, hint at something much more. Could the so-called Tartarian Empire have been a civilization so advanced that it unsettled the carefully constructed timeline of history? Could it have been deliberately dismantled, its legacy absorbed, its monuments rebranded as the achievements of far smaller nations? Even thinkers like Graham Hancock become part of this conversation. He has long argued that human history is missing entire chapters, that civilizations far older than we admit may have risen and fallen before us. His work focuses on deep prehistory, on Ice Age cultures wiped out by cataclysm 12,000 years ago. Yet his central question applies here as well. How much has truly been forgotten? Tartaria, for its believers, echoes his warning that the past we are taught is a selective story, trimmed to fit an acceptable narrative. If Tartaria was real, then the truth about it would shake the foundations of everything we know. Imagine a world where free energy was harnessed from the environment, where architecture was both beautiful and functional in ways we can barely comprehend, where cultures across the globe were connected under a single banner of knowledge. Then imagine all of that deliberately destroyed, buried beneath mud and fire, and rewritten so that we might never know it existed. That is why the idea is so powerful and so dangerous to conventional history. The more you follow the traces, the harder it becomes to dismiss the suspicion that something extraordinary has been hidden. Whether Tartaria was a vast empire or a patchwork of civilizations bound by shared technology, its story raises the possibility that humanity has already reached heights we are told we are only now approaching. And if that is true, then the phrase, the Tartarian Empire, ancient civilization, more advanced than anything we can imagine, may not be a wild conspiracy, but a glimpse of a reality that was stolen from us. Aftermath and unanswered questions. If the story of Tartaria teaches us anything, it is that history is not always as straightforward as the textbooks claim. Whether you see it as a grand conspiracy, a misunderstood series of architectural quirks, or a suppressed legacy, the questions it raises refuse to go away. Why did the name vanish so suddenly from maps? Why do so many cities show evidence of buried levels and structures far more advanced than their time? And why do disasters, fires, and demolitions always seem to arrive just when uncomfortable questions begin to surface? For believers, the answer is clear. The Tartarian Empire was real, a global civilization more advanced than anything we can imagine today, and its memory was deliberately erased from history. For critics, it is nothing more than the human tendency to find patterns where none exist, to weave mystery from coincidence. Yet, in that divide lies the heart of the fascination. The possibility that an entire chapter of humanity's story has been hidden forces us to rethink what progress truly means. Even voices like Graham Hancock remind us that the past is full of gaps, silences, and mysteries we have yet to solve. Perhaps the real lesson of Tartaria is not whether it existed exactly as described, but that we should never stop questioning who writes history and why. The monuments still stand, the maps still whisper, and the silence still lingers. What was lost may never be fully recovered, but the mystery ensures that Tartaria will continue to haunt us, daring us to look deeper and ask, what else have they kept hidden from us? What do you think? Let us know in the comments.